Our next panelist is Kate Finn, Executive Director at First Peoples Worldwide, which provides tools and resources for investors, companies, and financial institutions to increase understanding about the ways to include Indigenous peoples in project design in accordance with the principle of free, prior, and informed consent as enumerated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Kate, you recently worked on a report called Harnessing Private Equity for Indigenous Peoples that focused on renewable energy investments in Indian country. My first question is, will you please share with us the principle of free, prior, and informed consent from the UN Declaration of Independence and how it plays a role in private equity?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. It's such an honor to join everyone here today. As Kiani said, I'm the Executive Director of First Peoples Worldwide, which is a program out of the University of Colorado at Boulder, but was a nonprofit for 20 years prior. So we have a lot of work working with Indigenous peoples. And our mission is to work from a foundation of Indigenous values to achieve a sustainable future for all. And that creates a really big umbrella that we get to do creative design work under all day long. But what we do every day is work to build capacity for Indigenous peoples, work to build capacity for investors, and then create a platform for the two to connect. And to do so in a way that's consonant with the human rights of Indigenous peoples and the values of the individual communities. And it's just my honor to work with so many distinct Indigenous peoples and Native movements in all of that. So it's kind of fun day to day to see who's doing what, how, and where, and to learn more on this panel. So I will dive right in now to FPIC. What is FPIC? It's a big word, but it's a little word. What do we do? So free, prior, and informed consent is enumerated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, of course. But really what it is an exercise of self-determination. And it's a safeguard of all of the rights of Indigenous peoples. So when FPIC is done correctly, what it does is it allows Indigenous peoples to create and to design and to amplify their own economic development priorities, and to do so in a way that's consonant with their values. So with their own cultural values, spiritual values, environmental values, whatever that is. So it prioritizes Indigenous leadership. When operationalized, FPIC prioritizes decision-making and the participatory rights of Indigenous peoples. So it creates a framework. And so I guess part of this and what we kind of sought to do with our private equity research is we said, wait a minute, FPIC is important. We've been working on this for decades. How can we bring this to a financial model? How can we bring this in? How can we use FPIC as a design tool to really amplify decision-making and participatory rights? And we were able to create some research around that. So just, FPIC is both a process and a right? It's free, prior, and informed consent. All of that takes a process. It's negotiating, it's understanding, it's giving and sharing information, integrating that information into a design process, creating moments of dialogue and discussion. And then at the end of the day, it's creating a moment where everyone at the table says yes, no, conditional yes, conditional no. What is that? So it's understanding going into a process that there will be a moment of yes or no. And it's really making sure that there's equity in the entire process and equity in the outcome. So what it can do in this space in terms of finance and investing is it can create a fair and cognizable framework and like a governance structure so that during deal engineering, there's value for all the parties. There's economic value that's spoken of. There's social value, everything is on the table. And that framework allows everyone to participate. What we know is that deal structures have largely been imported from extractive industries. And now as we move towards renewable industries and other types of economic diversification, let's not just import that same model. There's a moment that we can have right now, and that I think investors are ready for, particularly ESG investors, to disrupt. And FPIC is one way to set up a framework and a governance system to do that.
I love that. Mahalo, Kate. My second question is, while Ho'ahu's project is fairly small from a private equity perspective, our community does have larger long-term plans, as do other communities in Maui County. Do you see a pathway for indigenous-focused private equity to meet our community needs according to our community's values?
Absolutely. And I want to, press on Todd's point earlier that, things that can happen here in Molokai can be a model for indigenous peoples around the world. It's really about disrupting this pattern and this way of investing that's happened all over the place. So this is a point of inflection that I think can create a model that's really important. And I think there's a huge role for private equity in that. Building an indigenous centered governance structure starts when the capital stack starts. It's everything that Stephanie was saying, right? When you're looking at grants, there's grantors that want to create impact, and you get to be the impact. And how do you drive that? And then moving through, as you move through the capital stack, to integrated capital, to debt capital, to private equity, it's creating the structure that can thread through so that you make sure that the values and the goals are also threaded through the entire project. And I think a lot of it is about recharacterizing the way that equity is thought of. So, equity is, of course, the financial returns. It's all that, but it's also, what have indigenous peoples, what do people bring in? Well, how are resources valued? Because they're valued different by different parties. So let's have a conversation about that. How are we going to measure value? What is the equity? It's the personnel and the resources that people bring, as much as the money that they're bringing to the table too. Creating a conversation around that. And I think private equity is so interesting because it can be flexible, right? So you have a moment where you can decide how equity is captured, when it's captured, and you can really make those conversations live conversations. It's difficult, it's different, but it's disruptive by design, and that's the point. And I think Stephanie's point is well taken, that there's investors who are ready to do this and have this conversation. So I think that private equity is a way to test and bake in a lot of the things that create values alignment and return alignment as well. And I think, my final point, in terms of this community too, it's so common, and you have long-term goals, right? Your goals and your shareholders are your community, they're your children. They're the people that you're creating value for, and private equity is the long-term strategy as well. So I think it just goes back to the idea that using free, prior, and informed consent as a governance structure helps you to reach those goals with clarity, and that in a way that's cognizable to ESG investors.
That's beautiful. I love, expanding our way of thinking of this, extractive capitalistic model, where a tree that, contributes to our survival on this earth under an extractive capitalistic model doesn't have value until it's cut down and sold as lumber, right? And so I mahalo for sharing that. My last question is, do you see added value for investors in indigenous communities?
Absolutely. So, there's a lot of statistics out there, and one of them that's out there a lot is that, indigenous peoples steward a small percentage of the earth, but actually 80% of biodiversity is left in indigenous lands, right? So the resources that we need to all live together on this planet are stewarded by indigenous peoples. And there's a lot of economic opportunity, but there's a lot of opportunity for understanding what that stewardship is. So I think, there's going to be more attention to indigenous lands, and investors have a key role in helping to elevate stewardship. And one thing that we put forward in our research is that any investment in Indian country is an impact investment. And I think that's true in indigenous communities around the world, right? So where there's, a history of extraction, whether it be financial, whether it be the actual earth, whatever it is, we have to change that. We have to do that. And ESG investors are in a place to understand that the I can be threaded through ESG, and to do that in a really good way. So I think that there's a really ripe opportunity to align values and economic opportunities to do that. And I guess just from a very smaller risk management perspective, when investors can look at FPIC, when they can ask indigenous peoples, what are your values? Where are you seeing things? They can understand the totality of the risks that they're taking on, and understand the totality of what's going on, so that they know, they have a fiduciary duty to their own shareholders to understand what that is. And I think including indigenous peoples from the earliest points of any investment or project design is important from that. But I guess, the point that I think is the most salient here is that FPIC is a framework for deal engineering that creates equity. And I think that it allows ESG investors to amplify their values and to really find and create a right platform with indigenous peoples to forward indigenous peoples' priorities and goals.
Wonderfully stated. Yeah, in that ESG investment ahupua model, when indigenous peoples succeed in Malama Aina, everyone benefits, right? In the ahupua model I explained earlier, where with the lo'ikalo and recharging our aquifer, everyone benefits from more water in our aquifer. Mahalo, Kate.